Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Al-Shaikh and today I'd like to talk to you about rethinking architecture from past and future, the cases of urban Bahrain and rural Ghana. This presentation acts as a summary of the paper to be published as part of the conference proceeding. And this is part of a research investigation carried out by my colleague Dr. Maria Panta and I. To begin with, the paper to be published considers the global narratives of modernity and how the phenomena of globalization in relation to architecture and culture is manifested in the user's lived realities and experiences. It acknowledges the tension between tradition and modernity, between globalization and the politics of space or place. It draws an attention to the idea of modern as well as the experience of modernity, and what this may mean within a specific context that has special social, cultural, and environmental boundaries. The above are investigated through two case studies, one in urban Bahrain and another in rural Ghana. To give you a little bit of a historical background, since the 1980s in both regions, the growing globalization, modernization, and urbanization in the regions had caused the various local housing and building patterns as well as materials to become westernized. And at the same time, it caused a gradual disconnection from the local cultures and resources. Some argue that this has led to a loss of appreciation for architectural heritage and social alienation of citizens. The common perception of the locals is that the imported architecture and Western materials and ways of building are more modern and much better and preferred than their own. So basically what we are trying to express and talk about that we've got something called a gradual disconnection from the local cultures and resources. What comes to light is the relationship between change and continuity, and how the local people deal with the change and modernity in relation to their built environment and cultural needs. So, basically, the relationship between change and continuity and modernity and tradition is key. So, based on this introduction, the research expresses that the spatial experience of dwellers, as well as how these relate to the cultures in which those spaces exist, are considered, with a view to explore the meanings of space. And when we talk about meanings of space, there is an attempt to, first of all, look at architectural practice through the user's viewpoint, where more attention is paid to the specificity of a given place and the needs of local community. This means that we look at architecture through the user's perspective, which will help in establishing a more user-oriented architectural practice. Rather than that, we need to address some of the issues, challenges, and opportunities that surround the user's experience within specific social, cultural, and economic settings. All of this would lead to reconsider space through the non-physical aspects, which reflect the narrative of users' daily life or everyday life, and therefore emphasizes the importance of the user's experience of a built environment. Now, I would like to move to talk about each case study. So, as I explained, I have two community-driven case studies. Using two case studies from Ghana and Bahrain, the paper will discuss how such projects explore notions of continuity, tradition, and heritage, which embodies traditional knowledge and existing practices, and rethink notions of change and modernity. The two case studies reimagine built surroundings that are in tune with and responsive to the local context, cultural, social, economic, and ecological, and are rooted in local environments, traditions, and places. So, case study number one was the primary field work in the city of Manama, capital of Bahrain, which entailed investigation around the user's spatial experience on two levels, domestic and urban. And the image showing is of the standing tall architecture against the vernacular one. Case study 2, primary fieldwork in the village of Abitanam, which entailed first-hand involvement in the building process of a school canteen and a kitchen in order to observe and research the complexities involved in building with earth. Image showing the canteen and kitchen used by the school children. Moving to the first case study, Bahrain. Experiencing Manama through walking and discussion, the focus group. This is the primary case study of a PhD thesis titled Immateriality in Architecture, the User's Spatial Experience Within the Context of Bahrain. And it draws on cultural studies fieldwork conducted in Manama, the capital of Bahrain. The fieldwork entailed city walks with participants to document their spatial experience in February 2015, where the author used the participatory research in the form of focus group method for data collection in order to rethink the built environment from a broader cultural perspective. The investigation has led to conducting a workshop with a number of participants consisted of two parts, a walk followed by a talk. This research is interested in theoretical debates related to immateriality as part of the user's spatial experience and how these can inform the design process. It discusses the relationship between architecture as a creative process and the lived experience of people as a way of consuming space. The particular context that this research is interested in is that of Bahrain, as a typical example of geocultural part of the world whose economic condition and cultural values are changing fast. To discuss the culture-architecture relationship in Bahrain with a view to exploring the extent to which the former has an impact on the latter, and to investigate through the primary research how the understanding of the user's spatial experience could be enhanced as part of the culture-architecture debate. Around these questions, the case study poses its own aim. So, the first theme I'd like to talk about is a lack of connections between architecture, culture, and the context in which it exists within the contemporary setting. Recently, in order to transform Bahrain into a financial center, the country seems to be, or seems to have been, heavily influenced by globalization, which has directed efforts toward the development of communications, financial services, banking infrastructure, commerce, and tourism. Just like its neighbor, Dubai, towers of various forms and heights are standing to enhance the image of Bahrain as a way of marketing it to the world. Skyscrapers symbolize the favorite style in Bahrain nowadays and are intended to be of multi-purposes use, serving both housing and commercial activities. Apparently, not only Manama, cities in the Gulf region have been experiencing a massive and rapid urbanization, which has transformed them into something completely different to the traditional settlements that existed before. The new cities that were generated with the new buildings, roads, highways, etc., lack the basic sense of city life. In these new cities, pedestrians are not encouraged to walk around, but to use their vehicles instead, which means that people only see each other and the city through car windows. The lack of physical and social interaction with the outside world, outside the boundaries of the car, makes the city experience totally different now to how it used to be in the traditional settlement. The last theme to talk about, there is a need of the practice to recognize and promote a user-centered approach, reflecting the social and cultural conditions of the context. So again, in the focus group, the participants reflected on the meaning and definition of architecture in light of the city, culture, heritage discussion. Participants revealed that architecture is the container of all of what had been discussed, including identity, experience, reflection, and belonging. It is the concept, process, and production that exemplify the embodiment of communications, growth, and development, which could be considered as one of the processes of creating the city. It contains the people's culture and heritage when it creates the space and the place for them to practice their daily lives with all its dimensions. Architecture then contains the city as well as the city containing the architecture. So against this background, it seems that Manama lacks sense of cityness nowadays. The dispersing and interaction goods, information, and people is at its minimum level. The city is longer a major site of social interaction and exchange, which has its direct input on the way of thinking about the city and experiencing it. One should think about the city as an environment consisting of people, landscape, buildings, infrastructure, etc., which has an urban life engages the conceived, perceived, and lived concepts with spaces as Lefebvre describes. These interconnected concepts proposes a better understanding of the city. Moving to the second case study. This is the primary case study of a PhD thesis titled Approaches to the Resilience and Adaptation Through Community-Driven Construction Projects in the Global South. It draws an ethnographic fieldwork conducted in Abitonum, a remote village situated in rural Ghana. It entails the author's collaborations with the Inca Foundation, a local non-profit organization, NGO, through her practice or her participation in the Earth Architecture Construction Workshop, and her role as a community architect and laborer in Abitonum. This process necessitated the author's first-hand involvement in the building process of a school canteen and kitchen in order to observe and research the complexities involved in building with earth. The research makes use of the ethnographic method through participant observation and participation in order to rethink the built environment from a broader cultural perspective. The building material are considered as a tool to think about resilience within community-driven construction projects in the Global South, as well as the empowerment of local communities at hand. This case study poses two questions. How can local material and traditional building practices empower local communities in the Global South? How can the use of ethnography through participant observation help imbue culture and the spirit of people into the built environment? The research echoes Turner's view that material are interesting for what they can do for society, not for what they are, and considers the potential for resilience through the use of building material. The predominant vernacular building method in Abitonum is called attack pame. It originated from the town Attack Pame in Togo and is a method that uses wet mud bowls. Attack Pame is a specialized skill nowadays and labor is costly. The local mason and carpenters lacked adequate knowledge and experience of building with mud, which partly explains the widespread neglect of the old Attack Pame buildings in the village and the rural Ghana in general. The local community's aspiration is to embrace modernity and to be able one day to build their modern and more permanent houses from cast concrete blocks. Concrete promises to last longer than mud. The local community's priority is to save money and gradually invest in concrete blocks, which they usually store next to their mud Attack Pame dwellings, until they acquire enough quantity to be able to build their new modern houses. At the same time, the existing mud houses slowly fall into ruins. Their maintenance would entail repeating and replastering, which requires skilled and costly labor. The notion of modernity comes to light from conducting participant observation in Abitonum. In the 80s, the locals' once familiar scope of practices was confronted by a rapid encouragement of imported building materials and new technologies, including cement, corrugated steel sheet, and the use of formwork, poured concrete, and steel reinforcing, which are now considered to be local, and so on. What also surfaces is the struggle between change and continuity, and how the local people deal with modernity in relation to building materials. Western narratives of modernity in relation to building materials differ largely from the narratives of modernity in Ghana and the South at large. So Western architects, designers, researchers, and so on involved in such work assume that modernity poses a threat to the local culture and building practices. But in fact, local culture and traditions are not static entities. They are always in flux and predisposed to change. Thus, we need to reflect and research further as well as create awareness among the locals about the benefits of modernizing local traditional materials in coping with changing climate, social, and cultural conditions. By modernizing here, the paper refers or will refer to integrating the indigenous qualities and knowledge with those adopted from the West in order to create a modern identity of the place and also to achieve long-term benefits at a local level. Looking at both the perspective of the Inca Foundation, who advocate and encourage the use of earth in the construction of new buildings locally, and at the impact our project had on the local community by introducing pozzolana as a local low-carbon replacement of cement for the stabilization of the earth bricks. To the local mason, traditional building materials and continuity are unavoidably expressed in the relation or in a relation with modernity and change. Thus, there is a relationship between or to be recognized and renegotiated here. The one between the use of modern imported materials like cement, which is the local's choice, and the use of traditional local materials like earth, which is being reintroduced by the Inca Foundation with the aim to create resilience at a local level. The fieldwork and direct involvement in the construction workshop promotes or prompts the author to reflect on the global narratives of modernity and to deliberate over the question of how the phenomenon of globalization in relation to building materials and trends is manifested in the lived realities of the South. Therefore, the on-ground experience enabled the reconciliation of the two narratives of modernity, the global and the local. So, lessons learned. Drawing on the two case studies, the paper seeks to identify what could be learned from. Rethink the relationship between architecture and the user's spatial experience as a way of consuming architecture. Reviving heritage and tradition an often neglected heritage under the pressure of globalization. Thus, the findings from both cases demonstrate that in order to make a meaningful contribution to both the field and the local communities from the ground up, the choice of building materials and tradition-inspired space planning need to be based on concepts and categories which are explored and developed from the periphery itself. There is a need to reconsider the idea of being modern as well as the experience of modernity in a non-Western context. The paper will highlight the relationship between the universalizing and the particularizing narratives and of modernity, be it in the selection of use of building material, craftsmanship, tradition-inspired space planning approaches, and so on. It will explore how the two narratives might be reconciled. In the light of the above, the paper will argue that architecture has a role of service to the planet, to each other, and to the cities. In this stage of consumerism and capitalism, there is an urgency for the realization that we cannot rely on market solutions nor on top-down approaches to architecture and development. The choice of building materials and tradition-inspired space planning approaches need to be seen through the lens of questioning about their connections to culture, climate, and governance in order to be considered in the totality and to have resonance with the communities at hand. To wrap this up, let's brainstorm together. Local? What is local? Being there? Continuity and tradition as opposed to change and modernity? Unlearning? Listening? Open-endedness? Unpredictability? Uncertainty? Unforeseeability? As opposed to autonomy, purity, control. Thank you for listening.